I'd like to now have a brief conversation with you about Arthur Phillip, Captain Arthur Phillip, not to be confused with Lieutenant James Cook in 1770, Captain Arthur Phillip and the first fleet that arrived in Australia, setting up the first British settlement in 1788. When we talk about the first fleet, I'd like you to visualise something perhaps like this. Obviously, there were no aerial photographs and so on of what that fleet would look like. But entering into Sydney Harbour in January 1788 was a fleet of British ships. It possibly looked something like that artwork. They're arriving after quite a long journey. And you can see this journey, about 8 months long, marked on the map. How far they had come to Australia and how difficult that journey might have been. Captain Arthur Phillip, the guy in charge of the First Fleet, was quite an established, I guess he was a military hero and a navigator and a sailor. He'd worked in the whaling industry, which meant he had travelled the oceans of the world in some of the harshest conditions. He'd fought in wars against Spain. When he was sent in charge of this fleet to Australia as a captain of the Royal Navy, he was given an awesome responsibility. He actually had with him a number of officers who he had a great deal of confidence in, so much so that some of them go on to be governors of the colony of New South Wales. And remember, New South Wales was essentially the entire of the eastern part of Australia in these days. Arthur Phillip is designated to be the future commander of the entire colony, the governor of the colony, and everything happens to him. And this is a 1700s artwork of what he looked like. Again, supposedly at this new colony that is being built at Sydney Cove, at Port Jackson, inside Sydney Harbour. And if you know Sydney at all, that early settlement probably was around the Botanic Gardens, around the point where the Opera House is now. What must it have looked like? This is an early sketch of convicts in their gang being moved along to work under the supervision of British Royal Marine soldiers. These are professional soldiers. They were sent to this new colony to establish a colony. They were elite soldiers, but they were largely used in this colony as prison guards, something they really, really disliked. This other early image gives a really clear sense of that busyness, the activity of the early colony that perhaps is lacking in the first image I showed you. Captain Arthur Phillip, Governor Phillip, is in charge of this new colony. So let's talk a little bit about this first fleet that again we're seeing an early drawing of here at Sydney Heads. Let's talk a little bit about that fleet and that man, Arthur Phillip. The British Navy sent this fleet out to establish a penal colony in New South Wales. Cook was never expected to settle to make colonies. This was about setting up a prison colony, and the fleet consisted of 11 ships that were basically doing a drop-off mission at New South Wales. They weren't to remain. There were 2 more fleets. There was a second and a third fleet. The first fleet was 11 ships under the escort of 2 warships, one of which was the HMS Sirius, which was Arthur Phillip's flagship. There were 6 convict transport ships, prison boats, and there were 3 food and supply ships. They'd sailed for 252 days from Britain under the command of Arthur Phillip. He became the governor of New South Wales. How many people were on the ship? About 1,300. Somewhere the estimates vary. Somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 people were on these ships. There were 14 officials. There were 306 crew. There were 243 Marines. And this, of course, raises the question, why do all these people come here? Well, I'm going to argue the officials had no choice. The passengers may or may not have had a choice. Many of them are craftsmen, workers, who were paid a substantial wage to come to this colony. There were 306 crew. It was their job. They weren't going to stay. They were going to drop off and come back. And there were 245, roughly, you can see my approximation sign, 245 Marines That was their job in the military to come. Who else came? Interestingly, 45 of the Marines, approximately, brought their wives, and 9 babies were born on the journey. There were 543 male convicts who obviously had no choice. This was their prison sentence. There were 189 female convicts. Now, you might have heard stories that convicts were sent for small crimes to Australia. They were transported, is the term that was used, to Australia for small crimes, that they somehow weren't bad people. Most of the convicts that came to Australia, and their prison records are available, were repeat offenders. Some of the crimes that seem quite minor by today's standards, taking a handkerchief, for example, is one that's often used as an example, taking a loaf of bread. These were significant crimes in Britain at the time, at a time of overcrowding prisons and so on. And these were repeat offenders. You tended not to get sent to Australia as a convict if you were just a first-time offender. There were 11 children of convicts who had been born on the journey. Some of the female convicts, well, actually most of the female convicts, fell pregnant to either crew members or Marines. There are question marks, of course, about whether they were romances, whether the women were having sex with the guards and so on, and crew members to get special privileges, extra food and so on. And of course there's sexual violence, the violence of rape and so on that would have happened on these ships. It wasn't a pleasant journey. So I guess what we're saying is some of the people that came to Australia came for career opportunities. Arthur Phillip would have seen this as a step on his career path. Some of the officers would have seen this as a step on their career path. Some of the passengers on the crew would have seen this as an opportunity to make money. But the vast majority had no choice about whether or not they wanted to come to Australia. So that's a little bit about the First Fleet.